That assumption began to crack when German spies and analysts turned their attention to Detroit, Michigan. What they saw there did not look like traditional weapons production. It looked like something entirely different. Automobile plants were being converted at a scale no European power had ever attempted. Assembly lines stretched longer than entire airfields. Raw materials flowed in continuously: steel, aluminum, rubber, not in batches, but in rivers. Workers moved with rehearsed precision, trained not as craftsmen but as components of a system designed to never stop. German intelligence had spent years studying British and Soviet production. Nothing prepared them for what Ford Motor Company was building. The Willow Run plant, constructed by Ford in response to a single government contract, defied European logic. It was not designed to build aircraft the way Germany built aircraft: slowly, carefully, with highly skilled labor producing individual components. Willow Run was designed to erase the idea of individual aircraft altogether. Bombers were no longer treated as complex machines. They were treated as outputs, units, numbers. The goal was not excellence per plane. It was consistency per minute. German intelligence reports struggled to even describe the layout. One analyst compared it to a city dedicated to one purpose. Another noted that production schedules were measured in minutes, not days. At first, German intelligence dismissed the numbers as propaganda. American officials had exaggerated before. But as reports from neutral observers, foreign workers, and intercepted communications aligned, disbelief gave way to concern. The figures were absurd, and yet they kept repeating. The Ford plant was not aiming to build dozens of bombers per month. It was aiming to build one bomber every 63 minutes. Not eventually, not in theory, but continuously. A machine designed to start at one end of the factory and roll out the other end as a finished B-24 Liberator without interruption. For German officers trained to think in terms of shortages, bottlenecks, and skilled labor constraints, this was not just alarming. It was incomprehensible. What German spies were beginning to realize was that American industry was not trying to match Germany's Air Force. It was trying to overwhelm the concept of limits itself. And if those numbers were real, if even a fraction of them were achieved, then the war in the air would not be decided by tactics, pilots, or innovation. It would be decided by time. And time, for the first time in the war, was no longer on Germany's side. As German intelligence dug deeper, the problem was no longer whether the reports from America were exaggerated, but how such a thing could even exist. The Willow Run plant violated every assumption German planners had about war production. In Germany, aircraft manufacturing was fragmented by design: wings built in one facility, fuselages in another, engines somewhere else, all dependent on rail lines, vulnerable to bombing, and slowed by constant coordination problems. Skilled labor was precious and limited. Every aircraft represented weeks of work and the effort of hundreds of trained specialists. Willow Run operated on a completely different philosophy. Ford engineers had stripped aircraft production down to its most basic principle: flow. Parts arrived at one end of the plant on schedule, were assembled in a fixed sequence, and moved forward without stopping. No waiting for missing components, no pauses for retooling, no room for improvisation. German analysts struggled to grasp that the system was designed not around people, but around time itself. The scale was difficult to convey, even in reports meant for senior commanders. The plant covered more than 3.5 million square feet, with an assembly line that stretched over a mile long. Workers did not build bombers. They performed single tasks repeatedly, thousands of times per week. One man installed the same bolt every shift. Another attached the same cable. Another checked the same gauge. This was not inefficiency, as German engineers first assumed. It was the opposite. By reducing complexity at the individual level, Ford eliminated delays at the system level. Aircraft moved forward whether one worker was absent or not. New labor could be trained quickly. Precision came not from mastery, but from repetition. German intelligence officers noted with unease that this model could survive losses. Bombing one factory would not collapse the system. Destroying one plant would not cripple production. The Americans had designed redundancy into the very concept of manufacturing. What disturbed German analysts most was that Willow Run was not unique. It was a prototype. Similar principles were being applied across the United States. In California, Texas, Washington, and New York, Ford was not alone. Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, and Lockheed were all expanding simultaneously, competing not for contracts but for speed. American war production was decentralized, flexible, and geographically insulated from enemy attack. German bombers could not reach these factories. Sabotage was nearly impossible. Espionage provided information, but information alone could not stop a system designed to grow regardless of interference. German intelligence began using a phrase that had rarely appeared in earlier reports: industrial inevitability. Once activated, the system could not be slowed without direct invasion, an impossibility. By mid-1942, the implications became impossible to ignore. Even if German fighters achieved favorable kill ratios, it would not matter. Every bomber destroyed over Europe could be replaced faster than Germany could train pilots to shoot them down. Losses that would have crippled the Luftwaffe were treated by American planners as acceptable margins. Willow Run was not built to support a campaign. It was built to sustain attrition indefinitely. German intelligence reports shifted in tone from disbelief to urgency. Officers warned that the air war was becoming unwinnable, not because of enemy tactics, but because of enemy capacity. The Americans were not trying to win the next battle. They were preparing to win every battle after it. What German spies had uncovered was not just a factory, but a fundamental mismatch in how the two sides understood war. Germany still believed that victory came from decisive moments. America was preparing for a future where decisive moments did not matter, and once that future arrived, there would be no way to reverse it. By 1943, German intelligence no longer debated whether American production claims were exaggerated. The evidence was now arriving over Europe in aluminum waves. Bomber formations were growing larger, more frequent, and increasingly difficult to disrupt. What alarmed German officers was not just the number of aircraft, but the pattern. Losses that should have forced pauses never did. Entire bomber groups could be mauled one day and return to the skies days later at near full strength. This defied everything the Luftwaffe had learned since 1939. In earlier campaigns, attrition mattered. Aircraft losses created gaps. Gaps created opportunities. Now, losses were being absorbed as if they were expected, planned for. German analysts began to understand that Willow Run's output was not meant to overwhelm Germany in a single blow. It was meant to make resistance mathematically pointless over time. Reports from fighter commanders grew darker. Pilots described shooting down bombers only to see the formation tighten and continue as if nothing had happened. Escorts were appearing farther from the English coast, staying longer, turning back later. German intelligence linked this directly to production. The Americans were not only replacing bombers, they were expanding the entire ecosystem around them. Fighters, spare parts, engines, fuel, trained crews. Willow Run fed into a system that treated aircraft as consumables. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, still treated experienced pilots as irreplaceable assets. Each loss hurt disproportionately. German officers began to realize that the air war had shifted from skill versus skill to capacity versus capacity, and Germany was outmatched in a category it could not fix. The most unsettling intelligence summaries focused on tempo. At Willow Run, production targets were adjusted not yearly or monthly, but weekly. If output lagged, shifts were added. If a bottleneck appeared, the line was redesigned around it. American engineers did not ask whether a goal was realistic. They asked how to redesign the system until it became inevitable. German industry could not adapt this way under bombing pressure, labor shortages, and raw material constraints. The Reich had built its war economy to peak quickly. The Americans had built theirs to never peak at all. German intelligence officers warned that even perfect defensive tactics would only delay the outcome. You could not intercept a production line. You could not shoot down a schedule. Inside the German high command, this realization created tension. Some officers argued for radical changes, dispersing industry further, prioritizing fighters above all else, abandoning offensive bombing entirely. Others clung to the belief that technological breakthroughs would restore balance, new jet fighters, new weapons, new miracles. Intelligence reports from the United States quietly undermined those hopes. American factories were already adapting to new designs before German prototypes even reached combat readiness. Willow Run had proven that innovation could be industrialized. Once that happened, surprise lost its power. The Americans could turn novelty into volume faster than Germany could turn ideas into weapons. By late 1943, the conclusion became unavoidable inside intelligence circles, even if it remained unspoken in public. The air war was no longer about defending cities or factories. It was about surviving a system designed to exhaust resistance. German spies had uncovered the truth months earlier. When a nation can build a heavy bomber every 63 minutes, strategy itself changes. Battles stop being tests of will or brilliance. They become tests of endurance. And Germany was failing them one by one. What German intelligence finally understood was brutal in its simplicity. The United States had turned time into a weapon, and every minute that passed brought another bomber closer to the front. By early 1944, the consequences of American production dominance were no longer theoretical. They were visible in the skies, on airfields, and in the exhaustion of German defenses. The Luftwaffe was being forced into a role it had never been designed to sustain: permanent reaction. Every day brought new bomber streams. Every day demanded interceptions. Every day consumed pilots, fuel, and aircraft faster than they could be replaced. German radar stations detected formations assembling hours before they crossed the coast. Yet the warning brought little comfort. Knowing an attack was coming did not mean it could be stopped. Fighters were launched not with confidence, but with resignation. German pilots increasingly understood that their mission was no longer to win the air war, it was to slow it down. German intelligence reports from this period grew increasingly blunt. Analysts noted that American bomber losses, while still heavy, no longer altered operational tempo. Raids continued regardless of cost. Even massed flak concentrations and coordinated fighter attacks failed to disrupt schedules. Bombers arrived in daylight, in weather once considered impossible for large-scale operations. Escort fighters remained with the formations deep into Germany, eliminating the last safe zones where interceptors had once regrouped. The sky itself had become hostile territory. German officers began using language that bordered on despair. The enemy replaces faster than we can destroy. It was no longer a contest of tactics. It was arithmetic, and the numbers were merciless. At the heart of this collapse was a realization German commanders struggled to accept. Defensive success no longer depended on shooting down aircraft. It depended on whether those losses mattered. And American industry had ensured that they did not. Willow Run continued producing bombers regardless of the situation in Europe. A destroyed aircraft over Schweinfurt or Berlin triggered no pause, no reconsideration, no strategic retreat. Another bomber rolled off the line, another crew trained, another formation assembled. German intelligence concluded that even if the Luftwaffe doubled its kill rate overnight, the outcome would remain unchanged. The production curve was too steep, the system too resilient. Inside Germany, the effects rippled outward. Factories struggled to operate under constant attack. Transportation networks fractured under repeated bombing. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft that still existed on paper. Pilots flew fewer hours, trained less thoroughly, and entered combat at a disadvantage that grew each month. Meanwhile, American air crews gained experience at scale. Survivors rotated home. New crews arrived trained by veterans. What German officers once assumed would be an American weakness, inexperience, was being erased faster than expected. The production system did not just build aircraft, it built competence. By mid-1944, German intelligence no longer framed its reports around stopping the bombers. The language had shifted toward mitigation and survival. How long could factories operate under constant pressure? How long before fuel reserves were exhausted? How long before fighter units ceased to exist as coherent formations? The answers were grim. The American production machine had compressed Germany's remaining options into a narrowing window that closed a little more each week. Willow Run had not merely changed the balance of the air war, it had eliminated the possibility of recovery. German officers had once laughed at the idea that industry could decide the outcome of a war. Now they watched as the sky itself became proof that it already had. What made the situation unbearable for German planners was the inevitability. Willow Run was not a peak, it was a baseline. If production dipped, it rebounded. If a component shortage appeared, the system adjusted. German intelligence noted that American industry treated setbacks as variables, not crises. The Reich, by contrast, operated on margins that no longer existed. Every lost pilot reduced combat effectiveness. Every damaged rail line disrupted coordination. Every destroyed refinery cut deeper into already limited fuel reserves. American industry could afford inefficiency and waste. Germany could not afford either. The spies who had once laughed at exaggerated American claims now understood that the numbers had never been propaganda. They had been warnings. Inside the Luftwaffe, the psychological toll was devastating. Pilots launched knowing that even a perfect mission changed nothing. Ground crews worked under bombing knowing that repairs would be temporary. Commanders issued orders with shrinking conviction, aware that the enemy could replace everything faster than Germany could react. The air war had become asymmetrical in the most brutal way. One side still had choices, the other had only delays. German intelligence summarized the situation in stark terms. The enemy's strength no longer depended on success. Failure did not weaken it. Losses did not slow it. The system absorbed everything. In the end, Willow Run became more than a factory in German intelligence files. It became a symbol of a war that Germany had never prepared to fight. A war decided not by brilliance or daring, but by endurance and scale. When German spies were stunned to learn that Ford could build a bomber every 63 minutes, they were not reacting to a statistic. They were confronting the moment when strategy ceased to matter. The skies over Europe filled with aircraft not because the Americans were smarter or braver, but because they had built a machine that could not be outlasted. By the time the bombers darkened the sky, the outcome was already sealed. The laughter had stopped. The disbelief had turned into resignation. And German intelligence understood the most devastating truth of all. The war had been lost long before the last bomb fell, the moment American industry began to run without limits.